when I was in Guantanamo, I came across this dish. This dish is called moros y cristianos, which in Spanish means Muslims and Christians. The dish is actually black beans and rice, and you can assume that the Muslims are not the rice. So the point of this is that the conquistadors, the crusaders, and those who were fighting Muslims and Islam at that time, though they would have been fighting Muslims of all hues and all colors, regarded Muslims as black, very black, very, excuse the pun, in a very black and white way.
Yeah.
And the point of this was to say that the rise of the far right and ultra-nationalism doesn't really care what color you are, as long as you're a Muslim. If you're a Muslim, they don't care if you're white. You could be Caucasian. The name Caucasian means white in the Western world, but the Caucasus are dominated by
Muslims.
Right? That's the irony.
Yeah.
So they don't fit. They won't fit the label of white.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers, sisters and friends, and welcome to this Lockdown Islam 2020 Unscripted podcast. Today we're going to be talking with two special guests about a very important and a very tragic subject. It is indeed 25 years since the tragic Srebrenica massacre, the genocide that happened during the Bosnian War. We have with us today the enemy combatant himself, so to speak, Brother Moazzam Begg, and also the historian and good friend of ours, Sheikh Dr. Uthman Lateef. Assalamu alaikum, brothers. Thank you very much for joining us to discuss this important, somber topic. I wanted just to start us off with a bit of just a personal message, personal kind of story. When the Srebrenica massacre happened, where were you and what was your response, Moazzam? From the years of from late 93 until 96, I was in and out of Bosnia multiple times. So when the massacre happened, I just left Bosnia. And one of the things that, of course, was going on around that time is that I had joined an aid convoy and went with it multiple times from Britain and drove over to Bosnia. And during the period of 1994, I joined for a short period of time the Armia Bosanska, which is the third corpus of the Armia Bosanska, which was effectively known as the Mujahideen. The reason why that was because in Britain I had seen the videos that were called the massacres in Bosnia and Croatia that had been filmed by a brother who had gone from Leicester, and it shown some very horrific footage about what was taking place there. We'd known by this time, we're learning about the mass rape camps. We knew about the concentration camps in Omarska and Banja Luka and some of the other places, and that the ethnic cleansing was already taking place. So all of this is all the backdrop to before what happened in Srebrenica. And of course, there was another place called Gorazda where there were also massacres taking place. So Srebrenica was kind of the last straw, as it were, before intervention really came in the way that it finally brought an end to the war. But my experience was, and one of the things that I found particularly disturbing, wasn't the fact of what the Serbs had done. It was that they had done it under the presence of United Nations troops that had come from all over the world. This wasn't just British, Dutch, Canadians, Belgians who were all there. There were Pakistanis, there were Bangladeshis, there were Turks, there were Malaysians, and I know I sat with them and spoke with them and talked to them, and they were there armed to the teeth in the United Nations helmets and vehicles, and their white vehicles that had been painted with UN signs on. They had armored personnel carriers, they had tanks, they had helicopters, some had planes, and they were literally sitting and watching. And of course, if anything we know from the story of Srebrenica that we can talk about later is that the role specifically of the Dutch United Nations in that massacre. So I will never forget Srebrenica as long as I live. SubhanAllah. I do want to get into some of those points, but Uthman, where were you when you heard about this massacre?
And how did you?
Yeah, so Bismillah, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Yeah, I was in school, in fact. I was in secondary school in those years from 1994 to 1998. But my first vivid memory of the horrors of the genocide of Bosnia really came from demonstrations outside mosques. That people would gather sometimes outside mosques and have, posters of showing images of the victims of the genocide. People would, of course, sometimes collect and fundraise for funds to help those who are victims in the genocide. That was my first memory. But then growing up, I think in the late 1997, 1998, there was a lot of videos that were around about the horrors of the genocide. And I think it, of course, affects you very much as a human being. I think one of the things, of course, about genocide, it's kind of like the ultimate blemish, the ultimate stain on human history. It's like the shame on humanity. And remember, of course, in the Quran, when Allah speaks about the angels when they're discussing with Allah, and Allah says, "I've created Adam." And they said to Allah, "Taj'aluna fiha man yufsidu fiha wa yasfiku dima." You're creating somebody who's going to spill blood on the earth. This is like, the spilling not just of blood, but it's the genocide of Bosnia is like a representation of the most heinous of human atrocity, of the mass rape of a people, of the victimization, of the barbarity involved in the genocide, of killing, of rape, of sexual crime, of expulsion from the land, all of these things together. And so I think growing up, in my late teens, mid and late teens, I think had a profound effect on my sense of consciousness. Things I write about later, of course, I could go back to that time and think, what were my feelings at that time? But of course, I don't have the, of course, Moazzam, he lived through that experience in a more kind of pronounced or profound way than I did. But I think that there is something about injustice that seeps into our human collective consciousness anyway. I think that the accounts, reading about the suffering, reading memoirs, I think watching videos, all of these things have an effect.
Because you've got a chapter on this in one of your books, right?
Yeah, I have quite a few things. So my recent book on being human, of course, has a section on Bosnia. Even my upcoming book as well has a section on Bosnia. But I think there's the whole point about the fact that we're human means we have human codes of recognizability. And the fact that, you as a father then perhaps in a more what could you call, like a more elaborate way maybe could relate to what it meant to be a father, who loses a son or a daughter, for example, or you as a mother, or you as as a child of parents. So I think we go through these as human beings, in the course of a life. But I think that when it comes to the victimization of a people, you're going to see, as Moazzam was saying, about the fact that there were people who were bystanders and indifferent. In the course of a human, in the psychology of genocide, you're going to find groups of people that emerge. You will find the perpetrators, you'll find the victims, you'll find the bystanders, and you also find the rescuers. And the rescuers really is where we should be looking. Those are the ones who come to the aid and assistance of people who are suffering. But the theme of bystanding is quite important for me in terms of what I write about. Understanding what is the impetus that would drive people to become indifferent towards another people suffering when we're supposed to be able to relate to these conventions, or you might call these human codes of recognizability, in the fact that if you see somebody suffering, then you could in part and relate to it in very small part, although no human experience is exactly the same. So you can't understand what it was like to be in Srebrenica, for example. But you do know what it is like in a very small way to experience fear, for example, to experience death, for example. And these are supposed to just awaken the human spirit and consciousness. So
Assalamualaikum guys, sorry to butt in, But if you're enjoying this podcast, please head over to islam21c.com/donate to help us make more. And if you're not enjoying it, head over anyway and help us make better ones. Oh, no, Jazakallah khair. I mean, you know, I'm 34 years old, so I was like 9 when this happened, and even younger when the conflict started. So I don't recall firsthand kind of seeing the news and that kind of stuff. All of the stuff I've heard about from, you know, growing up is from you know, people like Moazzam who've been there, people, you know, telling the stories that they came across. I mean, and there's obviously, I'm not like exactly young anymore, right? So there's a huge number of brothers and sisters who they've grown up hearing bits and pieces about this, you know, and whenever you'll talk about, you'll mention things here and there, you know, like the UN troops and everyone was there and so forth. And we'll mention, you know, names like Yugoslavia and Serbian and that kind of stuff. How would you just kind of summarize what actually happened in a very kind of succinct way for someone younger than myself, for example, who didn't have that kind of historical or first-hand background?
Okay, so one of the things for the background is really important for us as Muslims and for the world in general. That at the time, just before the conflict in Yugoslavia, the country Yugoslavia, prior to that, the two strongest powers in the world were the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Nobody remembers the Soviet Union anymore very much. They just call it Russia. But Russia was simply the largest place within the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union fell apart primarily because of the defeat in Afghanistan at the hands of the Mujahideen. And when that started to slowly but surely disintegrate, all of these countries that were connected to the Soviet Union, whether it was part of the Warsaw Pact countries or the Central Asian Republic, or the Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, started to seek separation and independence. Simultaneously, other countries, and one of them, Yugoslavia, started to break up, and the various parties, whether it was Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, sought independence from the Yugoslav Republic. And the main player in that was Serbia, which was the capital was Belgrade. And they started to attack, first of all, the Slovenians, and then the Croatians, and crucially then the Bosnians. The difference was, and people really need to understand this, that Bosnia itself, Bosnia and Herzegovina, is an area that borders two different countries, or modern countries, and those countries are Serbia and Croatia. So the Bosnian Serbs always had the support of Serbia proper. The Bosnian Croats had the support of Croatia proper. The Bosnian Muslims had the support of nobody but Allah. And so this was one thing that we need to remember. Historically speaking, the Bosnians remained there as a result of the Ottomans entering that region. And during the communist period under Marshal Tito, it was okay, it was kept together. Nobody's real ethnic or religious identities really came to the fore. When communism went, everybody tried to reassert their identities and so forth. And ancient chasms, ancient wars that had taken place against the Ottomans now rose up. And during the cancer of extremes nationalism that was employed by the Serbs, they were allowed first to start again, as I said, against the Slovenians, then the Croats, and then more crucially than anybody else, the Muslims. And I just want to say that for the modern context, two things. It's really important that we understand this today. When we talk about Islamophobia today, we must remember and remind people that what's happening to us as Muslims in Western Europe is unprecedented in terms of European laws. In Europe, the biggest massacre, the biggest genocide that happened after World War II has been against Europe's indigenous Muslim population. And you don't get more Islamophobic than genocide. And we've got to remind people that this is where we live, this is where we exist right now, and that the shadow of Bosnia still rears its ugly head over parts of Eastern Europe. When Brenton Tarrant, who's the guy who walked into the masajid in Christchurch and shot 52 people dead as they were praying, including children, he took aim and he was live streaming and he was listening. He had earphones and he was listening to something. What he was listening to as he killed those children and men and women as they prayed in the masjid, he was listening to Serbian nationalist songs. Now, he's a white Australian non-Serbian, non-Slavic person, but he was listening to Serbian nationalist songs that praised the war criminal, the indicted war criminal, Radovan Karadzic, who was the president of the Bosnian Serbs.
Mm-hmm.
So he was listening to Serbian nationalist songs that praised him. And think about this, in a world of color and racism and black and white and so forth, this racist looks at these white Slavic Muslims, but doesn't see white people.
Yeah.
The moment he puts the label of Islam upon them, they become anything but white. And it's important that we put it in that context so we recognize its very strong link from Srebrenica, what happened in that mosque just last year.
So it's interesting you say that, because this book that I wrote on being human, how Islam addresses othering, dehumanization, and empathy, this was in fact written as a result of the attack last year in Christchurch, New Zealand, by IERA's idea. It was launched this year, in fact, in Christchurch, New Zealand, and we had the mayor of Christchurch attend the event and the book launch. But one of the interesting things about that is the fact that, as you were mentioning, Moazzam, in the psychology of genocide, there's going to be a whole process of dehumanization that takes place against a people. One thing is, if you look at it in a small way, we think about social anxiety, is the fact that the Yugoslavia breaks up, and then of course Bosnia becomes this multi-ethnically kind of entrenched as a place. Social anxieties create a sense of they entrench that sense of self and otherness, right? So here you have a place where people had been living together for centuries, Muslims, Croats, the Christians, without much incident. But the moment you have that sense of selfness, the binary distinctions between the self and the other are exacerbated, are entrenched, are kind of made more, and that's what happens. So when you mentioned, for example, what happened in this guy Brenton Tarrant, it's interesting because in his text, the great manifestation, I think the name of his text, he references Karadzic. He also references Pope Urban II. He's appealing to the Crusades, appealing to that sense of dehumanizing language. Therefore, the Muslims, the Bosnians were called Turks. They were called Turks. He calls Muslims vermin and rats and roaches, cockroaches. And it's almost like you're seeing them as an infestation that needs to be removed for the sake of your own survival. And that's really what genocide is predicated. It's predicated on this sense of very entrenched sense of selfness, and then creating that real distance between yourself and the other. And it's very disturbing that there's a pattern, in human genocide. It's very sad. If in the accounts of the victims who said that we didn't expect that our neighbors would do those kind of things to us. Our neighbors, shopkeepers, people, friends that we knew, and just shows that therefore the great extent of hate and what it produces. It's interesting. Also,
these are people that were ethnically, they look the same, right? They look very similar to.
It's very true. It's like, for example, in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis. They're both blacks, Africans, but the moment that kind of the propaganda seeps into a nation's psyche, they'll see the other as an existential threat and affair. For example, when in the siege of Sarajevo, you had this one thing I referenced in my book also was the fact that on Belgrade TV, they had this account where they said that Muslims are feeding Serbian children to lions in a zoo, right? On Belgrade, on the national TV. And this was watched by millions of people, right? And of course, it was fictitious, but it was just purpose to really ingrain this seed of hatred, of fear against that Muslim other. And it's very disturbing, of course, but that's what happens, in human genocide.
Yeah, so Uthman explained how people started to say, we were living together, and all of a sudden later, I'll tell you a little story, personal story. Well, a couple of stories that actually made me decide to go to Bosnia. And this was in 93. So I met first of all in Birmingham. They brought many refugees who had come over from Bosnia, Croats and Bosnians, but mostly Bosnian Muslims. And they come to the mosque, and I met one sister, and she had lost her mind. And the Bosnian brothers who were with her told me she'd lost her mind because she had been gang raped by Serb soldiers, and a child was murdered in front of her. So that was already, if that wasn't enough, then I sat with his brother. I remember he was a graduate of Sarajevo University, and he was sitting and talking to me. His name was Samir. I remember today. As we're talking, he very casually starts to scratch his leg. He rolls up his trouser leg, and then he pulls his leg off because it's prosthetic. And we're talking, and I'm a little bit shocked because I'm a lot younger. I'm not early 20s. And we continue to talk. He's telling me exactly this thing, that my neighbors used to be my best friends. And then within days, literally hours, they become enemies. And as he's talking, he lifts up his other trouser leg and he pulls off his other leg. Both of his legs, he's a double amputee because of mines that were laid by his very countrymen that he used to live with. And so this is like, to me, like a living personal example of those things of when people say we used to be together. They even said, one of the things was very weird in Bosnia at that time, as somebody who started to practice Islam with a great deal of zeal of learning of the Deen and so forth. You would go. I remember I hadn't memorized very much Quran then, but I was in Ramadan there, and they asked me to lead the Ramadan, the Salat al-Tarawih prayers, because the Imam, one of the Imams they had, all he knew was about 3 or 4 surahs from the Quran, from the last to the smallest ones, and they would recite Qul Huwallahu Ahad, Allahu Akbar. That's one of that. Next one, Allahu Samad. That's an entire rak'ah, because they didn't know. You could go to the mosques would be full, for no doubt in Ramadan, but so would the bars. The bars would be full too. I remember the first soldier, Bosnian soldier, Mujahid that I met, would just enter the city of Mostar, and Mostar has this beautiful Ottoman bridge that's over the river there, and that bridge had fallen into itself because the Serbs had bombed it. And as we went in, imagine driving down the street and you can see every house, every inch of every house has got a bullet hole in it, and those are the ones that haven't been hit by a rocket. The minarets of the architecture of the Bosnian masajid is beautiful. It's Ottoman, and it's those thin, slim, rocket-like minarets. And you see them; they've been targeted. They would target the minarets. And then I saw one of the brothers. He showed me that here's a big church we're going past, and there's a cross on there. And the brother told me that just a few weeks ago there was a body of one of the brothers that had been hung up there to be crucified. I mean, this was a war of intense hatred. And one of the people I came across, as I said, was making the point of it was weird for us to see Muslims like this. This brother, I remember he said he's from the Dhul-Fiqar unit. So I thought immediately, wow, these must be great fighters. And he comes into our car and there's broken Bosnian between us. And he smells of alcohol. I can smell alcohol. And he's barely sober. But that's normal in Bosnia at that time. And these are the guys that are defending Islam. That's how weird it was.
So the hatred that they had for the Bosnians, they weren't necessarily because they were practicing Islam, because there wasn't that much practice of Islam.
Their name was Ahmedovic or Begovic or Izzat Begovic, as you know, Ali Begovic spent a lot of time in prison simply for trying to find Islamic solutions to government. But yeah, it was precisely that. And because, as Sheikh Uthman said, because they regarded them as Turks, they said, you're not really Bosnian, you're not really ethnic Slavic people, which they are.
So was it like a hatred that was just bubbling under the surface all those centuries, or was it something newly kindled?
I don't know enough about that history to be able to comment, but I would say that definitely the new kindling was under the notion of, we are Serb nationalists, we are an empire, we are an ancient people, and the Turks came here. There was historically the famous battle at the Field of Blackbirds where some massacres took place, and they say that you are the inheritors of that, so now it is time for payback.
It's like the kind of language that, again, Ibn II was using in his First Crusade speech, about projecting the Turks as savages, as barbarians, as an existential other. It's like when you think about injustice against people, even like if you think like a mass killing or murder, even if it's just a simple murder, what's happening is that in our minds we have a mental canvas. And the canvas, if we're painting on that canvas with only wide brushes and only broad strokes, and you're only using one color, for example, and you're disallowing finer grades of distinction and the nuances, then what you're going to have at the end of it is you're creating a beast. You're creating your own enemy.
Yeah.
And doing that, you're imputing on the other, your enemy, the worst that you inherently see in yourself. Actually, I mean, that's a tragedy. That's a loss of humanity, even within killing, because you're effacing part of your own self in the effacing of another. And so it's a great tragedy, in fact, that these kind of things happen. But as Moazzam was saying, therefore, there is a people's attempt to reinvent, or you might even say recycle, things from the past as a justification for the horrors meted out against the people in the present, who could be very closely connected to you through social relationships. But these things become less meaningful when you're hearing the voices of selfness and national pride. And it's also quite sad, because if you look at the world now today, for example, that when you have this sense of nationalism
and the sense of lost glory.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, for example, look at the European nations like Hungary, for example, Austria, Poland. You find that when this is used in propaganda, there's more votes. People have more votes. They become more popular, and they like to hear the voice of we are a proud nation, and so on and so forth. I mean, there was, of course, I mean, this. If you think, for example, about, and this is why in Bosnia, the sad, the damning thing it's almost like the really vile thing is the fact that in Bosnia you have these Serbian leaders like the ones that Radovic, for example, and the butcher of Bosnia, Mladic, I think his name was, who are celebrated. These are like national heroes. These are like legends in Bosnia. And this is a person who didn't just, I mean, he didn't just kill the people. You have the whole thing about altitude, attitude, and Dave Grossman it wasn't just about killing people. It was really face up. It was rape of women. It was forcing prisoners to rape other prisoners. I mean, it was just the most vile and barbaric things to do. And this is a man who was celebrated. When one of them was imprisoned and he was released early, one of the masterminds of the genocide, there was a party held for him in the streets. People came out to clap for. Well, this shows that therefore there's something, very disturbing in the public consciousness when it comes to understanding human suffering and our role as a kind of a human race, responsibilities, and so on and so forth.
Is that because? Is that because were they celebrated because the people thought it was all fake news and they didn't really do those things, or did they acknowledge they did those things, but because they did it to our enemies?
This culture of denial, in Serbia, about whether this was really even a genocide, and always kind of, sent. There was in fact an exhibition that was put together last year, the year before last. That the guy who did it was a Bosnian, puts an exhibition together called like 11 steps of the genocide, like lessons to be learned. And he wants to hold this in Brussels, and it was refused, by members of the European Parliament. Many of whom in fact were complicit in the genocide in Bosnia, and then he wants to hold it in I think in Sarajevo at the end. But he was really upset because he spent like 1 or 2 years negotiating with the people in Brussels about having the exhibition, and then they refused it. And part of the reason why is because they said they didn't want to have images of Slobodan Milosevic or Mladic, no images of the perpetrators, of the victims, and nor did they want to discuss the causes behind the genocide. Now, of course, I mean, that's the whole thing, because how would you prevent a future occurrence without understanding what is the what is the sickness that seeps into the human conscience that would drive people to commit acts like these. And I think that's perhaps it's unique in the case of the Bosnian genocide that I mean, if you compare it, for example, to like attempts at reconciliation in South Africa, for example, apartheid, or you had so many things produced after the Holocaust, Theodor Adorno, and so many things, and even saying that, of course, the rise of ultranationalism in Germany is another thing. So I don't think it's interesting. I was in Auschwitz just a few years ago and Birkenau, and we had a tour guide who was taking us through Auschwitz and Birkenau, and she's Polish, and it's a big group of us and big group of other Europeans with us, and so she's showing us, and then we were quite shocked because by the end of it, she huddles us all together, and she says to us, something. She said the fact that Syria is happening today is a proof that nobody learned a lesson from Auschwitz, and it's so true. It's so true, because if you think about Syria, Iraq, Palestine, all of these theaters of great human suffering, it would have just taken, one, even one example of a mass killing or a genocide to awaken that human spirit, to realize that, something like this is. It's interesting that they said that after Auschwitz, never again. In fact, Theodor Adorno's line, the first line of his article, is a premier demand upon all education is never again Auschwitz, and so many kind of cliched statements like that. But but I think it's like what Noam Chomsky says, that there's always going to be examples of worthy and unworthy victims, and you're going to choose, your what side you're on.
One of the things that is, I think, quite unique about this conflict was the use of rape as a weapon of war. As unique it's not unique as in it doesn't happen anywhere else. It's happened everywhere else. But systematically placing women into rape camps, having them repeatedly gang raped, and the stated purpose the Serbs would tell the women would be that you will be giving birth to the next generation of Serbs. This kind of twisted mentality of treating the women in this way to this day, that trauma that exists within Bosnia is immense. And that's one part of it. The other part of it is if you speak to people who understand the Bosnian conflict and were part of it or had witnessed it, especially the older generation, but even some ones of the newer generation, they are very fearful that the conflict could reignite precisely because of those things that Uthman was mentioning. Of ultra-nationalism, not just in Serbia. This is a phenomenon across the world. You can see it in India.
America, Trump.
Make America great again. That's the whole...
It's right across the board. And in its crosshairs is Islam. Islam and Muslims are in its crosshairs. I just want to make a slightly different point. When I was in Guantanamo, I came across this dish. This dish is called moros y cristianos, which in Spanish means Muslims and Christians. The dish is actually black beans and rice. And you can assume that the Muslims are not the rice. So the point of this is that the conquistadors, the crusaders, and those who were fighting Muslims and Islam at that time, though they would have been fighting Muslims of all hues and all colors, regarded Muslims as black, very black, very, excuse the pun, in a very black and white way.
Yeah.
And the point of this was to say that the rise of the far right and ultra-nationalism doesn't really care what color you are, as long as you're a Muslim. If you're a Muslim, they don't care if you're white. You could be Caucasian. The name Caucasian means white in the Western world, but the Caucasus are dominated by
Muslims.
Right? That's the irony.
Yeah.
So they don't fit. They won't fit the label of white in the purview of these ultra-nationalists. So it's just important we remember that this, because it's now on the rise again, it is very dangerous, and primarily for the rest of the world, but also where the massacre happened itself. This isn't after World War II where the Allies all come along and occupy the place, and the Nazis cannot raise their head ever again. It's quite possible that this nationalism rises again.
Assalamualaikum guys, me again, reminding you to head over to islam21c.com/donate to keep the lights on Islam 21c. We pride ourselves on being independent and being funded by the grassroots community. So how do you look to the past to kind of predict or to try and stop something like that happening again?
Well, there's one thing, brother, I have to say. At the time, I remember it was called the Organization of Islamic Conference. They made a statement threatening the Serbian government and said that if you don't withdraw your forces from all the Bosnian Muslim territory, we will respond. That was 25 years ago. They still haven't responded. And that was the point. So what you understood from there is the collective response of the Muslim world, at best, was that threat. And if anything little more than that was to say, we're going to send some countries like Turkey, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Bangladesh, they sent their troops to become part of the United Nations peacekeepers. Peacekeepers. How do you keep peace between... Could you say you had peacekeepers when a genocide was taking place against the Holocaust was happening? How do you keep the peace? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَقَاتِلُوا الَّتِي تَبْغِي حَتَّى تَفِيَ إِلَى أَمْرِ اللَّهِ فَإِنْ بَغَتْ إِحْدَاهُمَا عَلَى الْأُخْرَى فَقَاتِلُوا الَّتِي تَبْغِي حَتَّى تَفِيَ إِلَى أَمْرِ اللَّهِ. That if one group transgresses against another, then fight the transgressor. And here the world recognizes the transgressor, but they sat back and watched whilst they had all the weaponry. And I remember, subhanAllah, there was one brother, I believe he'd been with the United Nations forces from Philippines. He saw what took place. He couldn't consciously remain as a neutral peacekeeper. He left his force and came back and he joined the volunteer fighters, and to imbue to them, to help them to defend themselves. Unfortunately, that's the world where we live in. The Bosnian genocide was stopped. Rather, the intervention happened after Srebrenica through the United States of America. The United States always takes kind of credit for this and says, look, we stopped it. And whilst it's true, they did bomb Serbian military posts and artillery posts and change the position of the war. The Dayton Peace Agreement meant that anybody that had come to help before, all of those people who had come to sacrifice their lives and so forth before, were now either to be kicked out and sent back to their countries, many of which arrested them, detained them, tortured them, and so forth. And that's a different part of the story. But the point was, it didn't empower them. They weren't strong enough and were totally reliant upon the very nations. It was under Dutch United Nations that Ratko Mladic brought his force in, whilst these people had fled to Srebrenica, refuge, knowing that there's United Nations forces there, they'll be safe. And they literally walked away when they knew Ratko Mladic was there. And infamously, as you know, 8,000 men and young boys were shot dead, unarmed, with their hands tied behind their back. And that's what we're remembering to this day.
What was behind the inaction of the UN troops?
I think it was
peacekeepers.
A combination of many different things. Having, the answers on the tin, isn't it? We're peacekeepers. We're a peacekeeping force. You're not they're told you can't intervene. I remember sitting with Pakistani United Nations soldiers who were so upset. They were so upset that they couldn't intervene. They said, we don't have the orders to intervene. They knew what was going on. Every single one of them knew what was going on. The Dutch knew more than anybody else what was going to take place. In fact, their complicity yet to this day has not been held. They've not been held to account under any circumstances. Anybody who allows something like that to happen, those men and women and children only came to Srebrenica because they believed that the Dutch would be protecting them under the United Nations. So their role in this, thus far, there were others, Canadians and so forth, involved in all sorts of abuses of the Bosnians themselves, sexual exchange and favors and abuse by United Nations troops. Their mandate was totally wrong. Their mandate should have been, if you're going to intervene, you're going to intervene to save life, not to watch it being taken.
So historically, there's this, conflict bubbling under the surface during this time, the time of the breakdown of the former Yugoslavia. Everything's kind of people feel that their future is precarious. They start their kind of identities start to take a more primary role. I'm just trying to get the kind of the historical order in my head. Some kind of jingoist ultranationalists take over the discourse publicly and begin to rally people against a common enemy, upon which they just project all the insecurities, all of they turn into this kind of beast and paint them with the crimes of some kind of beast in the past. Similar kind of narrative, similar mythology, even, or metaphors or discourse to the Crusades and to the Reconquista, and this a kind of similar thread running through. This precipitates in violence against these people. At what point does it, and the international community by and large, the UN, they're largely inactive. At what point does this become a rallying call for and an awakening for Muslims and Islam in this story?
You know, for the Muslims, it was quite early on. I met a brother who'd gone. There was a brother, I think he'd been in Afghanistan, Kashmir, and so forth. He was Saudi Arabia, and he first group of volunteers from around the world, from the Muslim world, to assist and help, and to actually physically take part in the defense of various Muslim towns and cities. And then it built up more and more. And for the Bosnian, look, one of the things that's really important, that at the time of when you think that death is going to come to you, even the one who doesn't believe starts to hope, and hope of intervention, a divine intervention. But when you know you're a Muslim, and whatever your level of practice is, it by definition, being closer to death will bring you closer to Allah. It just happens everywhere you go. And so this was no different in Bosnia, and people started to turn to Islam. People were going at the same time simultaneously. Some were fighting, some were going to Egypt to study their religion, going to Al-Azhar and coming back to teach the people about Islam. So there was a constant a movement of this amongst the Bosnians. And with the influx of people from around the world, there was good and there was bad, I have to say. There was both sides. There was, like with anything else, young people with lots of zeal, little understanding themselves of the deen, pushing things that they felt was the sole truth, was a problem because it caused problems between the understanding of Islam there with some of the locals according to their traditions. But there was this sense of the Muslims as individuals are coming to help, and they're coming from Gambia, they're coming from Mauritania, they're coming from Pakistan, they're coming from everywhere. And they're only coming from one reason. They're helping to help us because they're our brothers in faith. And this no doubt had an effect on the Bosnians. The response of the nations, as I said, it would be wrong to say nations didn't help. There were nations helping with the humanitarian effort, but then so were the European nations. The European nations were helping with the humanitarian aid effort. Britain, in all of this, again, I have to say that the British Muslims, once again, they took the bull by the horns, and they started to go across on aid convoys right across. And it was perilous to go through some places. Going through Croatia was perilous because there was a time the Muslims were fighting against the Croats too. So being stopped there, I remember at border checkpoints, some brothers had the Qurans taken and thrown on the floor, guns pointed towards us. All sorts of things were happening to us. We had to pray Salatul Khawf, fear whilst we're driving on the way to Croatia, hiding at the back, hoping that Croat, we call them, they're known as Ustasha, Croat secret police, don't get hold of us. And then the fear of perhaps you might just make one mistaken turn and end up in Serbian territory and then dead. So there was all of that sort of stuff. The Muslims from Britain and elsewhere risked all of that to bring aid and support to the beleaguered people of Bosnia. And that tradition continued. It continued over. I remember there was one convoy alone going to Syria, just one convoy that took 100 vehicles of food, medicine, blankets, fire trucks, rubbish trucks, doctors, and all of that stuff. That's still very much a British tradition that people are proud. People recognize British contribution to this day. Even if we're called all sorts of things around the world, that's still something for us to be proud of.
MashaAllah. It's beautiful that you said that people recognize, because in reality, history only remembers the ones who are rescuers. You know? I mean, the ones who are bystanders are kind of the ones that people, of course, would blame for the inactivity and the state of, indifference. But the ones who are the rescuers are the ones who are moved by that sense of human consciousness. But I think for the Muslims, of course, what motivates us is going to be our sense of connection as an ummah. Allah in the Quran says, "Innamal mu'minuna ikhwa." The believers are, of course, brothers. The brothers are like, the believers are like one building, one part supports the other part. You know, and it's very interesting because I think one of the surahs that really, I mean, this is from before and even until now, that really affected me and affects me a lot when it comes to understanding, human suffering, genocide like Bosnia, of course, is Surah Al-Buruj. Because Surah Al-Buruj in the Quran, I think, really outlines for us, the way that something like this could happen. The killing, extermination of a people overlap with that sense of, indifference. So, for example, in the Quran, when Allah says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إذ هم عليها قعود. One of the ulama focused on the fact it's only made up of a few words in the Quran in that surah, but it tells us so much about the psychology of killing and mass killing, together with that indifference. إذ هم عليها قعود. Sayyid Qutb bin Faqr rahimahullah says that in this, when Allah says إذ هم عليها قعود, Allah says when they were عليها, which is over the fire. And he says that it wasn't that they were over the fire watching people burning alive, but he says that they were قريبون من عملية التأديب, that they were so close to the action, to what they're seeing of that torture inflicted upon the believers, that they were enjoying it, right? That they were enjoying it. And he says that when Allah says qu'ud as opposed to julus, because julus would be that they're sitting like momentarily then leaving, but qu'ud, they're resting, they're taking their enjoyment, and they're watching the roasting of skin. And I was watching an account of one of the documentaries on the Bosnian genocide, where they said that when they told the Muslims, when the Muslims made a run for it, they were seeking refuge in the Dutch UN headquarters. I don't know the name of the place, but then they made a run for it to the woods, right? And then they were caught. And when they were caught, the Serbs were saying, like, we're not going to harm you, come to safety, and X, Y, and Z. And then they told them to go into these trucks. And in the trucks, they were taunting them, laughing at them, and it really just that whole notion of the depravity of the human soul. When Allah says, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, that's the self, consider the nafs, how it's inspired by that sense of real depravity as well as piety. And in this, Allah is saying that, إِذْ هُمْ عَلَيْهَا قُعُودٌ, when they're sitting over the fire, and they're enjoying it. And there's been so many cases in human history for people to become spectators at another person's suffering, like for when Gaza was being bombed, for example, and you had the Israelis sitting up on the mountains of Srebrenica.
I was thinking that as well.
And they had popcorn, and they're watching, and it's like an entertainment for them. In lynchings of black men in America, when they made a spectacle. There's a very good book called Lynching and Spectacle by Amy Louise Wood, and how thousands would come together and just to watch the poor man being lynched,
and print postcards and stuff.
I mean, so many things would happen like that.
Merchandise.
And it's like that's. I think it's now perhaps even more because everybody is now a photographer with a smartphone. But I think that what has to happen is the fact that we always remember our number one obligation upon Muslims because of the bond of iman that links us together, but also obligation towards humanity, and the fact that Allah made us of those who come to the justice, come to alleviate the suffering of all kinds of people, wherever they might be. But it's interesting that even in Surah Al-Buruj, Allah says, وَمَا نَقَمُ مِنْهُمْ إِلَّا أَن يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ, that they didn't harm them except because they believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like Moazzam was saying, it's like, they didn't have to be the best practicing Muslims. In fact, there's something I read about one of the leaders of the genocide in Bosnia said that he regarded the converts to Islam, from the Serbs as a kind of it's almost like I forgot the word, but it's like this deformed human being. Like he's not fully human because if he would convert to Islam, for example. But the fact that they just simply saw, well, that's a Muslim, and Muslim is existential other that we have to remove. I think it's very powerfully reflected in Surah Al-Buruj. And Allah, of course, is mentioning the Shahid and Shahood at least 4 or 5 times in that surah. The fact that there's going to be those who witness as spectators. But of course, what should be our imperative is to be of those who are active in resisting.
Moazzam and Uthman, you both mentioned, the necessity of being rescuers, and it's good that, the tradition of aid and humanitarian support is still alive. In terms of, I'm glad that you mentioned Syria, for example. But there was also another tradition that kind of, because of maybe legal norms and whatnot, that has kind of come to an end, and that is the trade of people leaving their the comfort of their homes and going out and carrying out jihad, physical jihad, in terms of, you know, helping people that are being slaughtered and killed. I mean, just from kind of memory. Obviously, I wasn't around at the time, but you know, you have Afghanistan, people traveling from all over the world, you know, to help, including Sylvester Stallone as Rambo. You know, it was kind of it was acceptable. It was cool then, you know, to help the Mujahideen there against the Soviets. You had many Muslims traveling from all over the world, either kind of condoned by their governments, or kind of you know, turning a blind eye against them, or against the wishes of those governments, traveling to Bosnia and so forth, and trying to.
Sorry. I mean, like, in relation to that, it's really important. One of the things that motivates people the most, and especially for me, the verse that strikes out at you, it really strikes out at you if you read it with sincerity. وَمَا لَكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what's wrong with you? That means there's something wrong with you. وَمَا لَكُمْ لَا تُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. That you don't fight in the way of Allah. وَالْمُسْتَضَعْفِينَ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ وَالنِّسَاءِ وَالْوِلْدَانِ الْمَعْلُونَ رَبَّنَا أَخْرِجْنَا مِنْ هَذِهِ الْقَرْيَةِ الظَّالِمِ أَهْلَهَا. That what's wrong with you that you don't go out in the way of Allah and fight for those weak, oppressed men and women and children whose cry is رَبَّنَا أَخْرِجْنَا مِنْ هَذِهِ الْقَرْيَةِ الظَّالِمِ أَهْلُهَا. Oh Allah, take us out from this town whose people are oppressors. وَجَعَلْ لَنَا مِن لَّدُنْكَ وَلِيًّا وَجَعَلْ لَنَا مِن لَّدُنْكَ نَصِيرًا. And make for us one who will befriend us and one who will come to protect us. This is why the people that I knew and people I went with and people I saw and have continued to see, that's what motivates them. They're not motivated by wanting to go and kill innocent people in the middle of the street. They're motivated by this intrinsic human, it's a human thing. Here in Britain, under the law, acts are based upon not just acts but omissions. If you see a child drowning, in a lake, and you do nothing and watch, you are culpable under the law. If you do nothing, you don't call the police, you don't just sit and watch.
Manslaughter.
It's an omission. It's recognized. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to you, what's wrong with you? So now we're in a world today where everything's turned topsy-turvy. And there's no doubt there are people that have turned it topsy-turvy. But the point is that according to the Quran, that those who don't help have got something wrong with them.
Yeah.
And the ones that go to help, they're not the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, La yastawun, they're not equal. And unfortunately, the world, the way it works today, it tries to criminalize that.
Yeah.
And in the absence, again, Bosnia's story is this, in the absence of the world doing nothing, the Bosnian massacres, genocide, Srebrenica, Gorazda, the rape camps, the concentration camps in Omarska and Banja Luka, all of this happened. The ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of people happened because there was nobody responding to Malakum. And even the world that knew that it was wrong didn't respond to it. So you're right there, brother. Unfortunately, just because certain people twist a particular tenet of Islam doesn't make it all of a sudden something that people shouldn't aspire to. Muslims would always aspire to it.
Yeah, SubhanAllah. But I mean, what is the future of I'm going to say something huge, like, you know, when we've got a few minutes to discuss this left, what's the future of jihad or something? But in terms, you know, so in terms of, okay, so that's an example of, despite there being a clear kind of norm, right? That's legally mandated. There was, you know, an ability of people to go and travel and fight physically with guns and so forth, in order to defend the people. Did that, in your estimation, overall, did that make a positive difference, or do you think it laid down the seeds or the foundations for what we're seeing today in terms of you know, the criminalization of jihad and giving and besmirching the name of jihad and that kind of stuff?
really funny is that I remember meeting British United Nations forces there, and meeting them, talking to them, and they knew that there are different Mujahideen groups, and they didn't see them with in a controversial way. Essentially, they, some of the soldiers. I remember speaking to one soldier, said, these people are doing a great job.
Yeah.
These people are doing the job that we should be doing. So it wasn't necessary that everybody saw each other as enemies. In fact, people saw themselves on the same side. But the future for this, brother, to be honest with you, is really dependent on our scholars, our leaders, and on our youth. Just because something's legal or illegal doesn't make it moral or immoral.
That's right.
Let's remember slavery. Slavery was very legal. In fact, I came across this shocking thing, brother, that the people that the term rendition, you connect it now with people like me, extraordinary rendition, and so forth. But it was first used ever in America to capture by slave patrols, who themselves later became policemen. They later became the police force. Slave patrols
to return
rendition back to their master. They placed upon them something called, excuse my language, this is what they call the nigger collar, and it has these 4 spikes sticking out of it. And what I discovered when I was in Guantanamo is that there was a company that made the shackles that I was wearing, and this company was called Hyatt's, and Hyatt's is in Birmingham in Great Bar, where I am, and they had been producing these shackles for as long as they'd been producing those same collars.
Wow.
The same people produced them.
Right.
And I went to them. I went to their place because I wanted to. How are you still making these things? And they refused to speak to me. Alhamdulillah, within a few months, they closed up, and they went back to America. And they still specialize in making shackles, and they most likely make shackles that George Floyd was in when he was. Yeah. So these links, brothers, it's important we remember them from these kind of oppressive places. But just for the future of our first of all, we need to be reminded. We need our ulama to tell them about the stories of those who stood up against oppression. What's our history? And whilst we need to be warned about people who take it to the language, to the world where that isn't Islam. Islam was never about. In fact, Islam came to stop the oppression of people. Whether it's on one side or the other side. But there will always be a people that will come to the defense of this religion, and they will make the difference. And the Bosnians say to this day that when they came, the foreigners came, they saved this. There's a famous story I remember about one of the towns where it's reported that 10 foreign volunteers came along. A Serb army was coming, and it was these 10 foreign volunteers who fought off the whole army. I don't know how much that is mythology or not, but the point is, it still lives in the memory of the people there.
Assalamu alaikum, guys. Last reminder, I promise. Head over to islam21c.com/donate to help this movement get to the next level. So we have genuine, high-quality media articulating Islam in the 21st century and developing confident Muslims impacting the world for the better. I mean, it's very. I mean, even growing up, I heard a lot of stories, amazing stories like that as well. Of people showing bravery and even miracles happening, on battlefields and so forth. And it's important to keep that spirit alive. But I wanted to link what we've been discussing about to something recent that's been happening. And you've both issued statements about, and we published things about Tauqir Sharif, for example. He's been on the podcast in the past. And that is, we were discussing an editorial meeting today with Islam 21c, and that is some brothers have a connection to Afghanistan, so they've seen members of their family, with going from kind of foreign fighters, so to speak, going there and helping in the jihad against the Soviet forces there. And then after they left, after they were driven out, the kind of groups kind of turned in against each other. And the Muslim Islamic groups, because of maybe reasons you can shed light on as well, ostensibly because of an inability to work despite their differences, and the kind of adab of ikhtilaf that Muslims should have in terms of dealing with their Muslim brothers and sisters. They kind of turned in on each other, and tribulations and trials started to happen. Something similar in Syria, some people are saying, the different rival groups and so forth, and there seems to be something with, Muslims, when we can't get along with each other, when we disagree with each other, we tend to, whether it's on kind of online battles or refutations, and people used to be PDFs. Now the trend is YouTube videos, refuting this person, that person. So the honor of the Muslims has become cheap on the online space, refuting people here and there and slandering and so forth. But when you're in a position like that, then the blood of your fellow Muslim can become unsafe as well, because it's just like the online sphere, but there's guns and power and resources involved as well. So I'm trying to formulate into this into a question, but it brings up so many other questions. Is this something specific to Muslims? Is this are we seeing something similar happening in Syria as was happening in Afghanistan? What's your analysis of this in terms of? I don't want to
Yeah, so this is a subject away from this. I mean, Srebrenica is part of that, but it's away from this because it's a bigger picture.
Yeah.
First of all, I'm speaking regularly to Tox's family and people over there in Syria and trying to push to try to get him released. And indeed, it is part of the inability of the Jama'at, the different Muslim groups, to unify that has caused this. But unity in and of itself now they don't even understand what that means. Because you put two, unfortunately, scholars in one particular place and they come out with 15 different opinions. And this is a major problem. Actually, when you take Afghanistan, it's quite different. Afghanistan, though it had groups at the time of the Soviet occupation, there were some. By the end of the occupation, and one of the reasons why the Taliban came about was to get rid of all of the warlords that came as a result of that occupation and the vacuum left therein. The Taliban have remained essentially under one structure and one hierarchy of leadership, and that hasn't changed. And they haven't dissipated into multiple groups, which you could expect, being under the occupation of the most powerful forces in the world, repeatedly. And they have dropped the most powerful conventional weapons, 25,000-pound bombs repeatedly dropped on Afghanistan.
Even experimental ones.
Yeah, I've seen some of I saw the 15,000-pound ones. I saw those with my eyes. So imagine these are many more times than that. Despite all of this, it didn't shake the unity. And there is a history to that. Then there's a cultural, religious perspective. And we have to recognize it. Because in the other places, whether you look from Algeria to Chechnya to Bosnia or wherever, such foreigners came, and even Syria, and a particular vision of Islam and unity manifested itself, you have seen repeatedly, one after the other, again and again, the inability to unify, the inability to become under one central command, the inability. And then what happens is that every single time, it may sound and look very good, and it does, but the end results every single time have been that not only the defeat, but also the dissipation and the change, that people who were once something are now the total opposite. And that has had a massive effect. And unfortunately, the lessons haven't been learned because they've not been taught. And we've been, I say we have been mistaken in not teaching them that. The Prophet ﷺ said, "La yudgh al-mu'min juhrin marratayn." Well, here we've been hit so many times by the same thing, and it's repeated itself again and again. In fact,
what are these lessons?
Positive story, I would say, out of all of this, it's Afghanistan. In that, I mean, you can call it positive, even though tens of thousands of people have died. Unfortunately, that's how we call positive. In that, they remained firm, they remained steadfast, they were clear on what they wanted. They opposed 9/11. They had nothing to do with it. They even asked for international lawyers or for bin Laden to be sent to a third party where Islamic law would judge what he had done or not. And that they say he acted outside their jurisdiction, and they were right. But they had the right, the intrinsic international legal right to defend themselves from foreign occupation, which is what they did until now, when they negotiated with the Americans and said, "We will talk with the Afghan government only once you, the occupier, leave. We want to have good relations with you. We want to have a good relationship with everybody, but not on occupation."
But that was after they were attacked, right? So when somebody is attacked, excuse me, that naturally makes people kind of get along, put their differences aside and fight the common enemy, right?
So, unfortunately, in many places, that's not what's happening. In Syria, it's not what's happening. And you'd think so. That's a logical thing, right? To think. That's what happened in Afghanistan under the Soviet occupation. The various groups, they got together and they fought. But yeah, that we have a problem, brother. And maybe perhaps Sheikh Uthman can tell us what it is, what are those problems that don't allow us to unite when under certain...
Well, it's like what you said, Brother Moazzam, about when you said to Salman about that was a logical thing. It reminded me of a hadith when the Prophet said that to Sahaba, you will fight and kill one another. Sahaba, they said, Ya Rasulullah, wa ma'ana uqulana yawma idhin. Would we have our minds, our sanity on that day? I mean, this shows, therefore, they're thinking, they couldn't envisage a time where that could happen. I mean, would we be sane, thinking people when that happens, And the Prophet said that, you would lose your minds in those times. And I think that, like you said, I mean, we're seeing everything, of course, has effects. The Prophet said that unity is rahmah and tafarruq is adab, and division is punishment. And we don't know what that punishment means, of course, because it could manifest in different ways, and we're seeing, may Allah protect all of us from it. But I think that seeing the fruits of unity and us embodying that in our communities would inspire the next generation to see that this is how Muslims should live, as opposed to living divided and that we're all, enemies of one another. We seek refuge with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah, of course, for ease in all affairs, and Allah brings us this. The Prophet of Allah said that he said that the Imam is a shield, al-Imamu Junnah, behind which the Muslims fight and protect themselves, and we ask Allah for that assistance from Him subhanahu wa ta'ala.
I mean that was that. Moazzam, you mentioned we failed in kind of imparting those lessons. So one of them is the importance of the unity and the wala of the Muslims that they should have for one another, the allegiance Muslims should have for one another. Don't let these relatively minor, compared to what bonds you, those relatively minor things get in the way of genuine cooperation and unity in the face of a threat. Are there any other lessons from this that we can, from the Tox issue, from the what you said about the Chechnya, Bosnia, and all of those lessons about this?
My conclusion is what I've seen. Everybody wants to live free. There's the famous saying of Umar ibn Khattab, who's reportedly to have said to one of the Umara, "Mata sta'badtum an-nas wa qad waladat ummahatuhum ahad." That when did you enslave people when their mothers gave them birth as free men, free people? And freedom here is the types of freedom that people seek in the Muslim world. It's already present in the West. We've got to put our hands up to it. That freedoms exist. Those freedoms of expression, thought, and freedom not to be persecuted. And I'm saying somebody who's been persecuted by the Western nations. I know the kind of persecution that's in our world. People want to get rid of it somehow. But you have to be exceedingly careful that in seeking to get rid of oppression, you don't become an oppressor yourself. You can't use oppression to get rid of oppression and then become, what is it that you... it's the famous saying of Umar al-Mukhtar, that they are not my teachers.
SubhanAllah.
He's fighting against an occupation force, and people are saying to him, why don't you do that which they do to you? He said, they're not my teachers. So this is what we're missing. We've missed it. We've missed it because what happens is that we keep asking for intent. We keep asking for Allah's attributes. Ya Rabb, antaqim minhum. Oh Allah, get our vengeance. Oh vengeance, one of vengeance. Take vengeance from them. But our religion is the one of which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam fights in every battle, 28 battles and sarai. And he says that if I was able to, if it wasn't harm other people and they get hurt, I'd wish to go in battle, fight, get killed, be brought back to life, fight. He'd love to defend his people. But even then, his mercy was this, that at the Battle of Uhud, when Sayyid al-Shuhada, the Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, is killed by an assassin, by Wahshi's spear, and then his insides are cut out and liver is eaten, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what does he do? With those people who did it. When he enters Mecca as the victor, he says, "La tathriba alaykum al-yawm, fa antum at-talaqa." There's no vengeance upon you this day. or you are free. And people entered Islam. You may be able to bring if you have a twisted version of Islam and try to force people to come to Islam by the sword, maybe some people might come for a short time. The moment they'll get an opportunity, they'll run. But when you do it the way Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did, fi dinillahi afwaja. They enter the Islam in droves, and they'll never leave it. And that's what I tell my brothers. I used to tell them in Syria, I used to tell them in Afghanistan, I used to tell them, I wasn't knowledgeable enough in Bosnia to know it, but by that time I was in Syria, I had enough experience. Say, brothers, please do not become like this. Do not come here trying to impose your vision of what you think of how much you know Islam on people who've been at the forefront of Islam for generations. Well, you'll turn people who love you into people who end up hating you. And that's unfortunately what happened. They didn't take the lessons, and they did the very same thing. And that's why somebody like Tox can be taken, a humanitarian aid worker who's been there for 8 years of his life, who is known for orphanages, for building villages for orphans and refugees, for building schools, Madrasa Tahfidh, teaching them English and teaching them Arabic, teaching them, bringing teachers and doctors and doing all of that. And in a moment, he can be taken at gunpoint by hooded and masked gunmen.
SubhanAllah. So, I mean, in essence, the issues of tarbiyah and maturity to follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ insofar as being careful how you act when you have the upper hand as well. You know, especially when you have the upper hand. SubhanAllah.
There's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing in Surah An-Naml. You know, it's about, you know, so it's a really beautiful. It's like, if you think about, you know, transitioning through space or landscapes, like you're entering into a new land. On the one hand, you have Sulaiman alayhi salam. Allah in the Quran says, وَحُشَرَ سُلَيْمَانَ جُنُودُهُ مِنَ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ وَالطَّيْرِ فَهُمْ يُوزَعُونَ. You know, gathered before Sulaiman were his army of humans and jinn and birds, and they're all arranged, all assembled. What comes to your mind, of course, is power, isn't it? Power, kingdom, might, civilization. But you don't always stay in that state. And so the next verse, Allah says, حَتَّى إِذَا أَتَوْا عَلَى وَادِ النَّمْلِ, until they come to the valley of the ants. And the chapter is called the chapter of the ants. And the valley is a lower space. You enter into new spaces. You encounter new people. And there are people who are, I mean, of course, the ants are small and minuscule. You can't see them. But they have a place. Moazzam says beautifully said that people want freedom. Reminded me when he was saying it about in W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, there's a line he says, Dum vivimus vivemus, which means while we live, let us live.
I laughed because I read that book in Bagram. I read it in Bagram as a prisoner.
Yeah. You remember that line then, Dum vivimus, while we live, let us live. And then he says that the female ant spokesman says, you know, udkhulu masakinakum, enter your ant, you don't want someone to crush you. Now, what emerges is quite amazing, because after all this happens, the makes his dua to Allah, Rabbi awzi'ni nashkuru ni'matak, and it goes on. Then, of course, the hudhud is missing, the hoopoe is missing, and Sulaiman is enraged, and he says, I'm going to punish you, I'm going to slaughter it, unless it comes with an excuse, you know. And then when the bird comes and says, I've seen something from, you know, Bilqis, and they worship the sun and everything. When he sends the letter to Bilqis then asked her noblemen and says, Aftuni fi amri, what do you think I should do? And they say to her, why are you stressing over Sulaiman? Nahnu ulu quwwatin wa ulu ba'sin shadid, we have power. And then she says, قالت إن الملوك إذا دخلوا قرية أفسدوها وجعلوا عزة أهلها أذلة وكذلك يفعلون. Now it's interesting when she says that when kings enter a place, they ruin it, and they turn the noble ones into inferiors. Ibn Abbas said to him, Allah, when it says وَكَذَلِكَ يَفْعَلُونَ, he says قَالَ الرَّبُّ, Allah is saying that's how they do it. he says قَالَ الرَّبُّ, Allah is saying, Allah is affirming that's just how kings tend to do things. I mean, that's what they do. And so it's really interesting the fact that Sulaiman, I mean, the whole principle of living by that highest sense of ideal and justice, when the Salahuddin recaptures Al-Quds, they had engraved on the gates of Al-Aqsa the ayah that وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزُّبُورِ مِنْ بَعْدِ الذِّكْرِ أَنَّ الْأَرْضَ يَرِثُ عِبَادِيَ الصَّالِحُونَ. I mean, there is a standard you're supposed to live by as Muslims. You know, when you come into power, in terms of your dealing with the people and showing of Islam and so on and so forth. But it's interesting, you know. We ask Allah for aid and tawfiq.
Ameen. SubhanAllah. I mean, it reminds me of this quote somebody mentioned today in our meeting by Maulana Maududi, rahimahullah. And it's a bit controversial, maybe a bit frank, but he said he's talking about why certain groups, the Muslims won't get victory through them, right? And he said Allah does not give izzah to certain individuals or groups, as Allah doesn't want Islam to be distorted through their stupidity. So when they're in power and they, you know, start oppressing people or start doing silly things, Allah doesn't want Islam's name to be.
Look at this, just reminded me, very quickly, because I need to leave. I have a class at 6. But you know, if you think about this, about the verse, what like in Surah An-Naml, maybe, I mean, amongst the Makkans before the Prophet came back in Fath al-Makkah, and he says, "La tathiba alaykum al-yawm." Maybe in the minds of some Makkans, they would have thought, maybe because they're kind of they're hearing propaganda against Islam, against Prophet, and they would have felt a genuine sense of fear. You know, when the Prophet came into Makkah, Abu Bakr, he brought, Allah please with him, he brought his father to come see Prophet, Abu Quhafa, you know, and he brought him out, and he's bringing his old man. And then the Prophet sees him bringing his father, the old man, to come and see him. And the Prophet says to Bakr, he said, هَلَّ تَرَكْتَ الشَّيْخ فِي بَيْتِ حَتَّى أَكُونَ أَنَا آتِيهِ إِلَيْهِ. If only you left the old man in his home, so I could have gone out to see him. And Abu Bakr says, no, Ya Rasulullah, he has more of a need to see you. Of course, Abu Bakr's statement is true. And then he says, فَأَجْلَسَهُ بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ. And then the Prophet, not saying sit down, he sat him down before him. ثم مسح صدره ثم قال أسلم. Then he wiped over his chest and then he said, now submit to Allah. فأسلم. Then he submitted. I mean, the prophetic method is perfect. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. I mean, this is how we need to learn. Allah give us tawfiq.
Allahu Akbar. I mean, that tells you, doesn't it? From you know, and this is how the Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was against those with people who were mushrikeen, who associated partner with Allah Subhanahu wa Taala.
Allah Akbar.
And it seems now that Muslims amongst each other can't even offer that kind of mercy and rahmah to offer to such people.
SubhanAllah. Well, I'm conscious of the time, brothers. Jazakumullah khairan. Really appreciate you joining us in this podcast. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Uthman. Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Uthman and Sheikh Moazzam Begg as well. And Jazakumullah khairan for you guys watching at home as well. Remember to, if you like this podcast, give it a like and a share and spread the news and some of our important content coming out about the Srebrenica massacre and genocide. We're very thankful to Uthman, Lateef and Moazzam Begg for joining us, and thankful to you again. So please do remember to like and subscribe and share this. Let us know what you thought in the comments. And also we're available. All of these podcasts should be available on wherever you find your podcasts, at Apple, Google Play, Spotify, Castbox, and so forth. And that's it for me. So until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Unscripted.